can't make of these photographs more or less than they are. They are simply photographs. The use we put them to, what we see in them, depends a good deal on our opinions.
It's an exciting tool for understanding a past age. You know, you can take a picture today, and tomorrow it's history. Look at this book. It must have 2,000 portraits in it. And all these people are dead, yet we know exactly what they look like. We know what kind of clothes they wore, how they felt that day. We can see the expressions on their faces. And with any other medium, you're not quite sure whether that lady's dress was covered with little roses, or whether this man really was wearing such a flamboyant tie. Perhaps the artist exaggerated a little bit. But with a photograph, you know that this is exactly what the camera saw. We're lucky to have these books. When Notman was taking amber types and tintypes, there was no need to keep records because there was only one. You couldn't come back and reorder. If you wanted another portrait, you had to have another portrait taken. But with the introduction of the glass negative, then innumerable prints could be made. And so Notman soon realized that he had to keep records because people would come back and make a reorder. So he devised this method of pasting the prints actually in the book. There's 12 to a page here, and there's 200 such books in the collection. We have about 400,000 photographs by the Notman's Montreal studio. There's 200,000 glass negatives of various sizes, from the small carte de visites right up to the mammoth plate 18 by 22. By 1839, when Daguerre and Talbot both announced their two separate processes, Notman was 13 or 14 years old, and he soon became interested in photography. So by the time he emigrated to Montreal, he was a very capable photographer. So it's no surprise that he was immediately successful in his portrait business. It's a Daguerre type of William Notman himself on his wedding day, 1853. Well, he came from a middle-class background, merchant family. Oh, well, he had extensive training as an artist in drawing and painting. Later, as a young man, he learned daguerreotyping in Scotland. Notman did grow up with photography, with the birth of photography.
This is one of the few surviving examples of the first commercially produced camera ever made by Daguerre in Paris, the year that the process was announced in 1839. It's a beautifully made instrument, really a piece of very fine furniture. It was designed to appeal to the clients at the time, the upper classes. The camera was focused by simply moving one box in and out of another. The first daguerreotype camera used a very simple lens. All that was needed was a simple device to cap the shutter and uncap it. The exposure may have been a minute and a half, 2 minutes, and then it was simply capped again, and the plate was then developed. That camera was equipped with a lens that was far too slow for anything but simple still life photography and occasional scenes. In the 1840s, a Czech-born mathematician, Joseph Max Petzval, working in Vienna, produced the first camera with a really high-speed lens, the all-metal Voigtlander daguerreotype camera, and it made portraiture possible. If the weather was good, perhaps a portrait could be made in as little as 10 seconds. Usually this meant that the picture was of an adult in a chair with a headrest. In North America, the daguerreotype took off like wildfire. There were 25-cent daguerrean rooms in several major cities. You had to be more than just comfortably well off to have your portrait painted by a competent artist. You could have your daguerreotype made for as little as 25 cents. No copies were available, but there was no negative from which you could make hundreds of copies for your friends. You made a daguerreotype, it was a unique image. Daguerre gets credit for having produced the world's first commercially made camera. But at the same time, William Henry Fox Talbot was working on a process in England that was to have enormous, far-reaching effects. Fox Talbot calls his process the calotype. The calotype, being a negative-positive process, was the basis of all future photographic processes for more than a century.
William Notman came to Canada in 1856 and very soon had a very successful business going in Montreal. And within a few years, he had expanded his business in several other Canadian cities. And eventually, he moved some of his operations down to the USA and had over 20 studios going.
Montreal in the 1860s was just entering its greatest period. You had a mean and hungry business class. They pile up enormous wealth. Montreal becomes an attractive place for people who want access to that money. People who are outstanding doctors, outstanding artists, people like Notman. It makes Montreal a very attractive place to come to.
He was the right man at the right time. He had innovative ways of advertising. For instance, the maple box was a real coup and really put his business on the map. In 1858, he received a commission from the Grand Trunk Railway to photograph the construction of the Victoria Bridge. The Victoria Bridge was finished in December of 1859 and wasn't inaugurated until the arrival of the Prince of Wales in the following summer. He produced 2 portfolios of photographs of the Victoria Bridge and of the cities and landscapes. About 500 photographs, enclosed both portfolios in a maple box, which was mounted with silver corners and silver hinges. This was a gift to the Prince of Wales. When the Prince of Wales showed the gift to his mother, Queen Victoria, she was so pleased with Notman's work that she pronounced him photographer to the Queen. He built a new portico in great block letters. He put the royal pronouncement, photographer to the Queen. And many of the pictures of the wealthy people of Montreal were taken in front of the portico. And so Notman got more free advertising in every picture.
They had family back in England, and so then they would send these little photographs off, and it looked pretty impressive, especially if you'd seen your brother going out in steerage on a ship, and there he is 10 or 15 years later underneath this sign that said, "Look, I've made it."
These people were scramblers who were usually one step removed from the woods or from the farm or from a pretty desperate working class life of their own.
Yeah, but a lot of these people were rich already. Before they came here, they really had no reason to come unless they really want to contribute to the empire. It's cold and wet and miserable over here. Nobody really wanted to come unless they had something to contribute. A person probably would find it a lot easier to work his way to the top here. The class system hadn't really got itself established here as it was in England. It had been there for generations. And here it was all new.
You wouldn't choose to come to Canada if you had land and property and a good life over in England. They could come here and buy land, something that must have epitomized success in the old country, to own your own land.
There was a lot of wealth in the city. There was a big French population, but there was about 60% English-speaking in Montreal at that time, and many of them were Scots.
The Montreal that Notman showed was a much more English Montreal than it is today. The wealthy were predominantly, but not exclusively, English, and the poor were pretty evenly mixed French and English.
The merchant class really ruled the city, of course. And there was a strong military presence as well.
The military presence in Montreal was an English presence, and they were very definitely the creme de la creme, second sons of a lot of the title people, and they would do their time here and then they would go back. And occasionally, pretty young daughters of all the aspiring merchants would catch one of these men. They were marrying up.
There was a civil war in the States, which was good for his business because there were a lot of British military people here, just keeping an eye on the border. A lot of the soldiers came in and had their pictures taken.
There was a period when the studio was turning out 14,000 portraits a year, which is an awful lot, especially when you consider it was in the wet plate period. So to do 14,000 a year, he had to have a big staff of photographers. He obviously didn't take all the photographs himself. He would take the pictures of prominent people or interesting characters, and his other photographers would do the rest of the sitters that came in.
The very minimum that you needed to pose a person was a simple chair, sometimes a quite elaborate Victorian design, of course, because of the era, and a headrest to keep the person's head as immobile as possible during the long exposures. Elaborate studios had backdrops, pieces of classic furniture, classic statuary to create a mood. Naturally, pictures taken like this always had a rather posed and rather stiff look. They had to remain like statues during the exposure. Children were also photographed in a little chair like this that had a device that would clamp the child, dress or suit to the back of the chair and keep them as still as possible. But children, of course, were very difficult to photograph. By 1860, the wet plate process began to take the place of all of the earlier processes in regular use. And it had many advantages. It produced a negative, which was capable of being reproduced an infinite number of times. And furthermore, it was much faster, so that the exposures were relatively short, and so that photography in the field, as long as you were dealing with relatively patient people, was a reality. This is a typical wet plate camera, perhaps built around 1860. And cameras then were still essentially pieces of furniture. They were the products of good cabinet makers. The lens was considered the most valuable piece of the camera. The exposure was long enough so that no shutter mechanism was needed. There was usually just a cap on here, and in some instances, photographers used their hat to make an exposure that may have lasted 2, 3, 5, 10 seconds, depending on the lighting conditions.
The wet plate process was one of the finest processes, but it was very cumbersome. And you had to carry not only the glass plates, but also a dark room, developing trays and chemicals out in the field with you. You'd find a scene that you wanted to take, you'd set up the camera, and then set up the tripod and put out your developing trays and your chemicals, and then wait till the light was just right, and make up your wet plate, pour the chemicals onto the plate and flow it on evenly. Put the plate in the plate holder, cover up the lid, rush out and put it in the camera, take the picture, and dash back into the darkroom tent and develop the plate before the emulsion dried. It was very cumbersome and inconvenient, but the result was one of the finest, and the detail is amazing. Not only did he take portraits, but he himself traveled widely and later on sent his photographers across Canada, from Newfoundland to Vancouver. What he called views were done purely on speculation. Tourists especially would want to buy them to commemorate their trip to Canada, or the citizens would buy them to send back to the old country to show them what their new home looked like. Pictures of snow scenes were very popular. The snow piled up in the streets, that was a popular thing to send. Portraits of themselves in the studio, which was set up as a winter scene, and they decked themselves out with a fur coat and snowshoes to show their family what it was like in the wintertime in Canada. Canada was a very exotic country with snowshoes and toboggans and things that weren't common in Europe.
There is a double edge to the exotic appearance of Canada back in Britain, and to the people in Canada who still had a strong sense that they were British. They were not simply living in an exotic land. They were living in an exotic land that was part of the British Empire. The bracing climate stimulated them physically and intellectually and morally, and it made them higher in all respects.
Notman wasn't a documentary photographer, as is understood today, where you find whatever's wrong and you take pictures of what's wrong. He found what was right and took pictures of that. Because the tourists aren't going to buy pictures of immigrants pouring off the ships with their little bags clutched in their hands. It wouldn't have sold, so he wouldn't have taken the pictures of it. There were floods in Montreal that wiped out people. Every spring, when the drains unfroze, you would end up with disease. People died like flies, and there was no record of them ever having existed. He may have felt sorry for them, but he didn't feel it was necessary to record it. He seems to have taken a few pictures just on spec of interesting people. People who probably didn't pay for their pictures. The plasterer is one of the pictures in there. Is obviously somebody who's just come from plastering a wall somewhere, probably in the studio. He may have just taken the picture because it looked like an interesting person. Another one of a similar style is the herb doctor, carrying his basket of herbs. Chances are that fellow never had enough money to pay for a photograph. In fact, Notman may have paid him.
When Notman photographs the lumber trade, what he shows is an idealized picture of what the lumber trade was. You see men working as men, strong, in the wilderness, surrounded by these great high trees, and you see them shaping them and the great rafts going down the river and all the way out across the seas to England. He does not show the absolute devastation that the lumbering operations caused. At one time, the Canadian forests along the St. Lawrence and the Ottawa River were full of trees that were 4 to 6 feet thick. Those are all gone. For every tree that was considered good enough to send overseas, there might be 20 or 30 cut down in order to get at that good tree. When the Canadians saw lumbermen, they didn't see these rather noble figures working with their muscles in the bush. What they saw were men who came back after a winter in the bush, drunk, brawling. They saw men who had to organize in gangs, again according to religion or nationality, in order to hold their jobs, who had to fight each other. And you would have seen men who came back with really very little money to show for a winter of extremely hard work. What you see instead is a healthy wilderness with men looking at least semi-noble, working on a part of it and not causing a whole lot of damage.
This photograph contains about 300 figures. The occasion here that the composite is depicting was a fancy dress skating carnival put on in honor of Prince Arthur, who's over here standing here.
He issued an invitation to everybody who was invited to the ball to bring their costume down to his studio and get themselves photographed according to a sketch that his art department had made up. And then he photographed each of the people wearing the costume that they would be wearing to the ball, and then he'd cut them all out and stick them all together. One of the main reasons for the composite photographs was not to fabricate an event. It was to record an actual event that did happen, such as the skating carnival, which was held in 1870. And it was totally unphotographable. It was indoors, everybody was moving, and the film was very slow. You couldn't even record a smile, let alone people sailing past on skates.
The invention of the gelatin dry plate was a revolution in the development of the photographic process. For the first time, there was a variety of factory manufactured emulsions available. This meant several things. First of all, the plates were dry. That meant they could be preloaded into a camera and kept for days, weeks, and months before they were used, both before and after exposure. Since they were factory made, they tended to be more consistent, and the process was inherently much faster. That meant that you now could take an instantaneous photograph.
The Canadian Pacific Railway was interested in having photographs to advertise the railway line to attract tourists and also to attract settlers who would use the railway to ship their produce. Notman sent his eldest son, William McFarland Notman, to the west, the earliest trip in 1884. He eventually made a total of 8 trips, all in connection with the CPR. These photographs were used in brochures and posters. They were also sold in the railway cars and in the hotels.
The idea that wilderness was romantic was something that people like Notman helped to create. To most Canadians, the wilderness was a dark place where terrible things happened. Accidents could happen to you, you could freeze to death. There was nothing romantic about this. When the CPR built across the West, at first, they didn't have a whole lot of traffic. All they had was scenery. And what you had to do was to convince people that this scenery was something beautiful, and then you could build a hotel and charge high prices, and people would go there and they'd provide traffic for your trains. And that's what all those big photos of the West are about. Wow, this is really beautiful stuff, and it worked, it worked.
For the tourists, the most interesting thing would have been the exotic. The Indians, they were a very popular subject, and the Indian pictures are still popular now. Further west, they were still nomads. They were still living in tents, and this is a very exotic subject. And Europeans just loved this image. I think he's responsible for the present-day image of Canada. People would come over here just to say that they'd been in the wildness of Canada and survived.
The wilderness and its darkness was romantic. But so was technology. There was something superhumanly powerful and awe-inspiring about a bridge or about a big steam engine. Both of these are dark, massive, mysterious, and powerful things, powerful beyond the ken of man, and yet created by man.
Notman documented the birth of Canada and the opening of Canada by the railway. It's an incredible story of the opening of a country.
There is no doubt that these people had the qualities that were needed at the time. They were qualities of single-mindedness, single-minded desire to make money, to become rich. They had that ruthlessness that was needed. They had the qualities that were essential in order to build the society. They were people who fit the time they lived in. These photographs are really a monument to the entrepreneurial class that laid the foundations of modern Canada. This is the class that built the banks and the railways that developed Canada. This is the class, in fact, that was the major force in putting Confederation together in the first place. That class has gone.
When the Kodak camera came out in 1888, most of the interesting pictures were taken by the amateurs. It was very popular immediately. Anybody could buy one and go out there and take whatever pictures he wanted to take without employing a commercial photographer to go out and take pictures.
I think all of us would say at a certain moment, oh, wouldn't it have been nice to be back in Victorian times, because life was simpler and everything. But we are thinking of then just the privileged people for whom life was simple. For the vast majority of people, it was work, work, work. You couldn't be sick a day. And fear of illness, fear of what your neighbor would think, and fear of scandal, fear of where the next dollar was coming from. People were really so insecure. So that when we look back at these photographs, we are looking at the nicer aspects of the Victorian way of life.
William Notman died in 1891, but his two sons carried on the business. The youngest son sold the business in 1935. The collection of negatives and prints donated to McGill University for the McCord Museum, and the Notman Photographic Archives was formed.